Hi there, I am Eric, and let's talk about France. France, aka the Big Blue Blob in EU4, is a country with a long and interesting history, famous for their fighting ability and also their culture. In EU4, the game starts in 1444 and will begin a bit before that, quite a bit before that actually. The oldest traces of human life in present-day France are from around 1.8 million years ago. At the end of the last glacial period at around 10,000 BC, the climate became milder, which meant that the inhabitants became sedentary, from being nomadic hunters and gatherers. At around 7,000 BC, the area of France entered the Neolithic era. The oldest city in France is Marseille. This city was a Greek colony from the 600 BC era. However, at the same time, the people known as the Celts started occupying parts of France. The Celts' origin is subject to debate, and there are several theories with different kinds of evidence backing them up. France became known by the Romans as Gaul and was completely conquered by Julius Caesar in 52 BC. This conquest has been called a genocide before. Turn the clock forward around, say, 550 years, and now the Roman Empire is falling apart. The whole fall of the Roman Empire is a story in and of itself, but suffice it to say, Gaul stopped being Roman, even though in some ways it continued to be, as did most of the former Roman Empire. The period after the Roman Empire's fall is known as the Dark Ages, which is a term that isn't used that much anymore by historians. It's kind of a Eurocentric term, as the rest of the world didn't live through a dark age during this time period. Anyway, Gaul, or France, was divided into several Germanic kingdoms, and the most important one to this story is the tribe known as the Franks, which the name France comes from. The history of the Franks is bloody, filled with conquest, and also religion. The Franks actually won a battle against an Islamic army in a battle known as the Battle of Tours in 732. This was during the time period that Islam was controlling larger parts of Iberia, and central France is as far as they got into Europe. Speaking of religion, it was Clovis, an early ruler of the Franks, that was the first Germanic conqueror that after the fall of the Roman Empire converted to Catholic Christianity in 508, and this really changed history. This is where Christianity started to merge with, in quotation marks, barbarian culture. It was especially Charlemagne that started converting people by the sword. This was something the church hadn't really done before. Charlemagne and the Papal State were buddies, the Papal State being the last surviving entity of the Roman Empire in a lot of ways. The Franks were the Papacy's bodyguard, and in return, the Pope gave them his blessing. This friendship resulted in Charlemagne being proclaimed the Holy Roman Emperor, which was an attempt to re-establish the old Roman Empire, but more holy. This further cemented their historical association with the Catholic Church. To summarize the Franks' history, it is characterized by the ruler dying, and then by tradition dividing the land between his sons, and then they start fighting and the strongest one wins and reunites the territories. The Merovingian dynasty gave way to the Carolingian dynasty, the one Charlemagne was a part of, in a sort of coup d'etat blessed by the Pope. Some Viking invasions later, and France became a very decentralized state. The noblemen hence took over, and feudalism was established in the 11th century. It's from the feudal system that the king's vassals became more and more powerful, to the point where they became an actual threat to the king. A result of this is the famous Battle of Hastings in 1066, where William the Conqueror became the King of England. He was the Duke of Normandy, which essentially was a French vassal. So the vassal was in this case strong enough to claim and take over the throne of another country. Here's when we start seeing the tensions between France and England, which would later explode to the 100 Years' War. The Carolingian dynasty ruled France until 987, when Hugh Capet, Duke of France and Count of Paris, was crowned King of the Franks. His descendants would be known as the Capetians, did I get that right? But also the House of Bourbon, and a name you probably recognize, the House of Valois. A bunch of dynastic inheritance and wars later, France is more unified. In 1190, the Kingdom of France was declared by Philip II Augustus, a member of the House of Capet. His predecessors had been known as King of the Franks, but Philip II was the first French monarch to style himself as the King of France. France is also very involved in the Crusades during this time period, both in an attempt to restore Christian access to the Holy Land, but also to eliminate heretics within France, like the Cathars that lived in southern France. Christianity sure didn't look that peaceful now. Anyway, a French king named Charles IV the Fair died without an heir in 1328, and that's a problem, because under the rules of Salic law, the crown of France couldn't pass to a woman, nor could the line of kingship pass through the female line. It seems like dynasties during history almost always had some sort of no girls allowed policy going. So, because of the Salic law and the no girls allowed policy, the crown passed to Philip of Valois, now Philip VI, a cousin of Charles IV. It would, maybe, be fairer if Charles IV's nephew Edward would get the crown. But rules are rules, and Edward had to be satisfied with being crowned the King of England. So, this is the point in history where we see the House of Valois rule France, and it's during Philip's reign that the French monarchy reached the height of its medieval power. But Edward, the guy who maybe could have gotten the job as King of France, seemed angry. Being Edward III, King of England, wasn't enough, and in 1337 he contested Philip's seat on the throne, just when the Black Death broke out, and the famous 100 Years' War began. There were back and forth fighting, with boundaries changing greatly over time. England had territories on the European mainland for a long time, but famous leaders as Joan of Arc and La Hire kept making problems for the English as they won back territories for France. But, like the rest of Europe, France suffered by the Black Death, and half of the population died, a staggering 17 million people. France did win the war in the end though, in 1453. Turn the clock forward a bit to the 16th century. The French Renaissance meant big changes for France, and amongst other things, cultural changes. The French language was standardized and became the official language of France, but also for the European aristocracy as a whole. French culture had a big influence on European culture for a long time. Charlemagne was, as I mentioned, crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. At this time, France is now a sort of a rival to the powerful Holy Roman Empire. A war between these European superpowers was the Italian Wars, aka the Great Italian Wars, aka the Great Wars of Italy, aka the Habsburg-Valois War, or the Renaissance War. Just pick a name already. It was Charles VIII that wanted some of that sweet Italian territory. It ended up with 62 years of war with the Habsburgs. Sadly, for Charles and for France, they lost in the end. The war started in 1494 and ended in 1559, with most of the major states of Western Europe involved. Even the Ottoman Empire got their hands dirty. France also started to dabble in this new business of colonization. French explorers such as Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain claimed lands in the Americas for France, the beginning of the French colonial empire. As Protestantism spread through Europe during the 16th century, France had their internal religious war. This was a civil war known as the French War of Religion, aka the Huguenot Wars, between 1562 and 1598. This war is said to be the second deadliest European religious war behind the famous 30 Years' War. Around 3 million people died due to violence, famine, and disease. The war was fought between Roman Catholics and Huguenots, also known as Reformed Protestants. This war encompassed areas around France as well. Within this war, we see battles between the aristocratic houses of France. The Reformed House of Condé, which was a branch of the House of Bourbon, was at odds with the Roman Catholic House of Guise, which was a brand of the House of Lorraine. The war culminated with the War of the Three Henrys. Yes, that's actually what they call it. King Henry III of France, King Henry of Navarre, and Duke Henry of Lorraine, who was funded by Philip II of Spain, were the three Henrys. The French Henry, the last from the House of Valois, was assassinated. The story goes something like this. On the 1st of August, 1589, Henry lodged with his army at St. Cloud, preparing to attack Paris. The end of the war was in sight. In comes a Dominican friar named Jacques Clement. He says he has a message for the king. Jack gives the king a bundle of papers, and the king signaled for his attendants to step back for privacy. Jack whispered in the king's ear and then stabbed him. This fanatical Dominican friar, Jacques, was then killed by the king's guards. The king's wound did not seem fatal at first, but it was. The day after, when the army was supposed to storm Paris, Henry III died and the army just melted away. Within the city, people were overcome with joy and saw the assassination as an act of God. The coalition broke up and the war ended. In short, you could say that the war was a loss all around. There was an uneasy truce. Roman Catholic supremacy was preserved, but the monarchy was weakened. The Protestants got some rights through the Edict of Nantes, but hostilities between Catholics and Protestants continued. The famous House of Valois was fully out of the picture in 1589 with the death of Henry III, to be replaced by the House of Bourbon, namely the Protestant King of Navarre, Henry IV. He then left Protestantism, due to political reasons it's told, became friendlier with the Pope, and was the guy who signed the Edict of Nantes, giving some sort of religious freedom. Henry IV's legacy is one of building and restoration. During his reign, there were various enterprises set up to develop trade in faraway lands. One example is the trade company set up to trade with Japan and the Moluccas. He was a bit of a pacifist when it came to war, which laid the ground for France's rise to European hegemony, and he is one of the most admired French kings. He did, however, just like Henry III, get stabbed by a Catholic fanatic and died in 1610. His wife, Marie de Médicis, or something, served as a regent for their 9-year-old son, Louis XIII, until 1617. Louis XIII then ruled until his death in 1643 due to illness. In terms of expansion, he focused on colonial expansion during his lifetime. French-Japanese relations started up during his reign. There was actually a Japanese samurai who played a big role in this, a man named Hasakura Tsunenaga. He was a Roman noble of Japanese descent in the 17th century. Louis XIII did, as many French monarchs, have issues with the Habsburgs. It was purely due to political reasons that he intervened in the 30 Years' War. France was Catholic, and Louis XIII was of the opinion that the Habsburgs were too powerful. So instead of doing what God maybe would have wanted, he only saw the threat of the ever-growing Habsburg Empire. Actually, France's greatest victory against the Habsburg Empire, which at this time also included Spain, among other places, was during Louis XIII's reign. Kind of, because this victory took place 5 days after his death. Unfortunately for him. His son, though, which might be the most famous of French kings, is Louis XIV, aka Louis the Great, aka the Sun King. He had the longest reign in European history, from 1643 until his death in 1715. That's over 72 years. He lived in the age of absolutism, and France was during this time period a leader in the growing centralization of power. During his reign, France fought 3 major wars: the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of the Spanish Succession. The Franco-Dutch War, also known as the Dutch War, was fought between 1672 and 1678. After the 30 Years' War, Sweden and France were kind of buddies. It was more complicated than that, but let's call them buddies. On one side, there was France, Sweden, Munster, Cologne, and England against the Dutch Republic. However, the Dutch were later then joined by the Austrian Habsburg lands, Brandenburg Prussia, and Spain. Spain lost territories to France, who can be seen as the winner of the war. The outcome was inconclusive in many ways, but had great importance for the events of the next 40 years. At the end of the war, France fought pretty much alone against a powerful coalition. France was now known as pretty much the great military power of continental Europe, and Louis XIV now became known as the Sun King. 10 years later, in 1688, the 9 Years' War broke out, known as the War of the Grand Alliance, aka the War of the League of Augsburg. It was pretty much a conflict between Louis XIV and a European-wide coalition. Around 100 years later, something similar would happen. The coalition consisted of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, Spain, Britain, and Savoy. This war is sometimes considered the first truly global war, as there was fighting in Europe, North America, and even India. At the end of the war, the participants were fiscally exhausted and signed a peace treaty in 1697 that favored France. The conflict pretty much laid the groundworks for the next war, the Spanish Succession War. This was my first episode ever, and I'm still in the learning process, but I hope you enjoyed the episode anyway, and hope to see you in part 2 of the history of France.